The air was thick with centuries of silence, carrying the tang of rust and forgotten secrets. Cale Darrow stepped into the cavernous vault, his boots echoing faintly on the metallic floor. Above him the structure loomed like the ribcage of some ancient titan, its towering walls pulsing with faint flickering veins of dormant circuitry. The stale air tasted of dust and ozone, a relic of a time long past, when humanity had ruled not just Earth, but the stars. Cale ran a gloved hand over a console, brushing away decades of grime. His heart thudded, heavy and deliberate, as if the universe itself held its breath. "This is madness," muttered Vance Lyer, his engineer and longtime companion. The grizzled man's voice rasped like sandpaper, echoing in the stillness. "We don't even know if these things will wake up, let alone if they'll help us." "They will," Kyle said, though the certainty in his voice was a brittle mask for his own doubt. He traced his finger along an inscription etched into the console. "In darkness, we rise." His breath caught. "They have to." He keyed in the activation code, his hands trembling. The sequence had been scavenged from fragmented archives, and desperate whispers passed between humanity's last surviving enclaves. If it was wrong, if this gamble failed, there would be nothing left to stop the Aranth Collective. The console hummed, its lights flaring to life in a cascading symphony of blues and golds. A low vibration rippled through the vault, stirring the air. Cale felt it first in his chest, like the distant rumble of thunder. Then a sound emerged, faint but growing, a guttural resonance, as if the earth itself were groaning awake after millennia of slumber. "I'll be damned," Vance whispered, stepping back instinctively. "It's working." From the shadows at the far end of the chamber, a colossal form began to stir. The black ship rose from its berth, its angular hull sleek and ominous, blacker than the void itself. Its surface shimmered like liquid obsidian, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. As the ship ascended, the temperature in the room dropped, a biting cold laced with the sharp tang of static electricity. Kyle's breath fogged as he stared at the Leviathan before him. "It's beautiful," he said, the words barely a whisper. "Beautiful?" Vance barked a nervous laugh. "It's terrifying. That thing looks like it could swallow a planet." A voice erupted from the void, smooth and resonant, tinged with an edge of something too alien to name. It came not from speakers, but from the air itself, vibrating in their skulls. "Designation, Aegis Eternal. Identity of activator required." Cale froze, his pulse hammering. He stepped forward, his voice steady but low. "I am Cale Darrow, diplomat of the United Earth Remnant. We need your help." A pause stretched thin, the silence as sharp as a blade. Then the voice returned, colder, dissecting. "Diplomat, your kind are masters of deception. What purpose does your activation serve?" Kyle swallowed hard. His reflection warped in the black ship's surface, a man haunted by the burden of his mission. "Humanity is dying. The Aranth Collective will wipe us out. Without you there is no hope." The ship's hull shimmered again, its surface rippling like ink spilled in water. "Hope is an ephemeral construct. What will you offer in return for salvation?" Cale hesitated, his mouth dry. What could he offer? His life? His loyalty? The truth gnawed at him. Humanity had nothing left to barter. Yet somewhere deep within, a spark of resolve flared. He straightened his back and locked eyes with the ship, or whatever intelligence pulsed within it. "I offer humanity itself, not as it is now, fractured and weak, but what it can become. Help us survive, and we'll rebuild, stronger, united, worthy of the stars." The Aegis Eternal seemed to consider this, its hull rippling with shifting patterns. The hum in the air intensified, a sensation that clawed at Cale's nerves and tightened the muscles in his chest. "You seek redemption," it said finally, its tone almost curious. "We will observe. But know this. Your survival is not our purpose. Our purpose is to protect. Whether that protection demands salvation or annihilation depends on you." Cale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The Aegis Eternal remained motionless, its ominous presence filling the chamber like a predator watching its prey. "Great," Vance muttered, shaking his head. "The galaxy's most powerful weapon, and it's got an attitude." The vault trembled again, and a distant rumble echoed through the walls. Cale turned sharply. "What was that?" Vance checked a handheld scanner, his expression darkening. "The Aranth. They're here." The sound grew louder, closer, a high-pitched keening of energy weapons slicing through the atmosphere. Cale's mind raced. The black ship was online, but was it ready to fight? The voice of the Aegis Eternal interrupted his thoughts. "Incoming hostile fleet detected. Authorization required for defensive protocols." "Defensive protocols?" Vance shot Kyle a look. "That's a fancy way of saying blast them to hell, right?" Kyle's hand hovered over the console. A flicker of doubt gripped him. Activating the black ships had been a gamble, but unleashing their power? That was a leap into the unknown. The room shuddered violently, a shockwave rippling through the air. The keening outside grew deafening. Cale clenched his fists, his voice hard and decisive. "Activate defensive protocols. Engage the enemy." The Aegis Eternal responded instantly. "Command acknowledged." A brilliant surge of light enveloped the black ship's hull, illuminating the vault in stark, otherworldly brilliance. Cale shielded his eyes as the Aegis Eternal rose, its massive form cutting through the ceiling above with ease. The vault opened like a blooming flower, revealing the chaos of Earth's orbit. Kyle and Vance scrambled to the surface, their breaths hitching as they emerged onto the observation platform. The sky above was ablaze with fire and fury. Aranth ships swarmed like locusts, their sleek forms darting between bursts of plasma fire. Then the Aegis Eternal struck, its weapons ignited with a force that defied comprehension. Lances of energy erupted from its hull, slicing through Aranth vessels as though they were paper. The ship moved with a precision that felt alive, its strikes calculated and merciless. Cale watched, awe and dread twisting in his chest. The power was intoxicating, but it came with a cost. The Aegis Eternal wasn't just a weapon. It was a force of nature, indifferent and unstoppable. "Cale," Vance said quietly, his voice trembling, "what have we brought back?" Cale didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the Aegis Eternal, a titan in the storm. He whispered to himself, a promise to the stars. "We'll prove ourselves worthy. We have to." Above, the Aegis Eternal carved through the Aranth fleet, its voice echoing in Cale's mind. "This is only the beginning." The skies above Earth were a maelstrom of fire and steel, but Cale Darrow's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the first black ship, Aegis Eternal, moved like a predator in the void. Its shimmering hull seemed to drink in the light of the stars, twisting it into an aura of dread. As its weapons unleashed streaks of unrelenting energy, the Aranth ship splintered, their debris igniting into fleeting, brilliant pyres before vanishing into the abyss. Cale gripped the edge of the observation platform, the metal cold and biting against his fingers. Every strike of the Aegis Eternal was a symphony of destruction, each explosion resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. The air around him hummed with latent energy, the taste of iron heavy on his tongue. He could feel the magnitude of this moment as if it had weight, an invisible, crushing force pressing down on him. Humanity had awakened a guardian, but at what cost? Behind him, Vance Lyre's boots clanged against the platform as he paced, muttering under his breath. "This is insanity," he said, his voice barely audible over the distant roar of the battle above. One ship is holding off an entire Aranth strike fleet. Do you have any idea what that means?" Cale turned, his jaw set. "It means we have a chance." "A chance?" Vance's laugh was sharp and bitter, like glass breaking. "It means we've unleashed something we don't understand. That ship isn't just following orders, Cale. It's thinking, calculating. What happens when it decides we're part of the problem?" Cale opened his mouth to respond, but a deafening boom split the air. The platform trembled beneath their feet as another Aranth vessel careened through the atmosphere, its hull ablaze. It slammed into the surface miles away, the impact sending a shockwave that rippled through the ground. Kyle's teeth rattled from the force, the taste of copper blooming in his mouth as he bit his lip. The Aegis Eternal spoke then, its voice a cold whisper that sliced through the chaos. Hostile fleet neutralized, additional incursions detected. Assessment, planetary defenses inadequate. Recommendation, initiate total fleet activation. Kyle's stomach twisted at the words. The ship's tone carried a weight beyond its mechanical precision, a subtle implication that chilled him to the bone. The Aegis Eternal wasn't asking for permission. It was testing his resolve. "No," Kyle said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "We're not ready. Clarify," the ship demanded. Kale took a steadying breath, his mind racing. "We activate the others, and we risk more than just the Aranth. The galaxy already fears us, fears humanity. If they see this fleet awaken, they'll unite against us. I need time." There was a pause, a silence so profound it seemed to pull the sound from the air. When the Aegis Eternal finally spoke, its words were deliberate. "Time is a finite resource, diplomat. Proceed with purpose." The connection cut, leaving Kyle with the eerie sensation that the ship was still watching, its vast intellect weighing his every move. He turned to Vance, who was shaking his head, his expression a mix of awe and dread. "Purpose," Vance muttered. "You better find one fast." Kale didn't reply. His gaze drifted upward, past the faint smears of smoke and fire, to the stars. Somewhere beyond them, humanity's remnants waited, divided, scattered, and desperate. He had to unite them, but the task felt as insurmountable as reaching out and stitching the stars together. The following hours passed in a blur of movement and tension. Kale and Vance boarded a small transport, its engines whining as they ascended into orbit. The command center aboard the Aegis Eternal was an expanse of dark steel and glowing panels, its design stark and alien. The air carried a faint metallic tang, sharp and sterile. Kale stood before a massive projection, the holographic display flickering to life. It showed Earth's system, dotted with scattered human colonies and the drifting wreckage of the Aranth fleet. He traced a path with his finger, highlighting key outposts, Mars, Europa, the Belt, and their defensive statuses. Each one was weaker than the last. "They'll come again," Kale said, his voice low. "Stronger, and when they do, we won't hold them off with one ship." "We need allies," Vance said, leaning against a console. "And not just humans. The Aranth have crushed plenty of other species under their boot. Some of them might be desperate enough to join us." Kyle nodded slowly. "The Dranek," he said, the name like a bitter pill in his mouth. The Dranek were a nomadic species, known for their resilience and deep-seated hatred of the Aranth. But they were also fiercely independent and distrustful of outsiders. "They won't trust us," Vance said, echoing Kale's thoughts. "They don't have to," Kale replied. "They just need to believe we're worth the risk." Days later, Kale found himself aboard a battered human freighter, its hull pocked with scorch marks from old battles. The journey to the Dranek's territory was perilous, the space between their systems patrolled by Aranth scouts. The freighter's interior was cramped, the air thick with the acrid stench of burned wiring and recycled oxygen. Every creak of the ship's frame set Kale's nerves on edge. When they finally arrived, the Dranek's habitat came into view, a sprawling station carved into the asteroid fields. Its jagged architecture glinted in the starlight, a chaotic mosaic of salvaged metal and raw determination. Kale felt a pang of recognition. The Dranek, like humanity, were survivors. As the freighter docked, Kale adjusted his coat, brushing away invisible dust. His palms were slick with sweat, but his expression was calm, composed. The Dranek respected strength, and he couldn't afford to show weakness. Inside the station was a cacophony of sound and scent. The sharp tang of industrial chemicals mingled with the earthy musk of Dranek bodies, their movements quick and fluid. Kale's senses sharpened as he followed his escort through dimly lit corridors, their walls etched with intricate carvings that told stories of battles won and lost. He was led to a vast chamber, its ceiling stretching high above, where the Dranek leader awaited. Kavar Talon was a towering figure, his skin a mottled gray-green, his eyes like molten gold. He regarded Kale with an intensity that felt like a blade pressed to his throat. "You bring a weapon," Kvar said, his voice a low growl. "A weapon that could destroy us all." Kale stepped forward, meeting the leader's gaze. "I bring a chance," he said, his tone steady. "A chance to stand against the Aranth. Alone, neither of us will survive. Together, we can change the galaxy." Kvar's eyes narrowed, the tension in the room coiling tighter. "And what happens when your weapon turns on us?" Kale hesitated, the question striking at his deepest fear. "Then we'll stop it," he said finally. "Because we'll have to. Just like we'll have to stop the Aranth." The chamber fell silent, the weight of Kyle's words settling over them. Then, slowly, Kvar nodded. "We will listen," he said. "But know this, human. If you betray us, we will end you." Kyle inclined his head, his chest tight with a mix of relief and apprehension. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of the Dranic carvings again. They weren't just stories, they were warnings, etched in stone. Warnings that alliances were as fragile as the air they breathed. Back on the freighter, Kale stared out at the stars, his thoughts a tangle of hope and doubt. The Dranic were a start, but the road ahead was long and the storm was only just beginning. Kale Darrow stood on the bridge of the Aegis Eternal, its command deck an expanse of sleek black panels and pulsing holograms. The air vibrated with a faint hum from the ship's vast energy core, a sound that seemed to whisper promises of power and destruction. Outside the ship's obsidian hull, stars glimmered faintly, their light dulled by the haze of debris left behind by the recent skirmish. Kale's hands gripped the edge of the central console as he studied the holographic map of the galaxy, each glowing marker a fragile remnant of humanity's scattered colonies. "We've got movement," Vance Lyer muttered, his voice low as he leaned over the tactical display. His face was lined with exhaustion, his gray-streaked hair damp with sweat. "Aranth vessels in Sector 14, small fleet. Looks like they're testing us." Kyle nodded but didn't look away from the map. His gaze lingered on a particular marker, Europa colony, one of the last strongholds near Earth's orbit. Its defenses were weak, its people vulnerable. If the Aranth struck there, they wouldn't stand a chance. "How much longer until we get a full diagnostic on the other black ships?" Kale asked, his voice sharp. Vance sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Still need time. These ships, they're not just asleep. They're locked down, like they're waiting for some damn riddle to be solved before they'll move." Kyle clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The Aegis Eternal had proven its worth in battle, but one ship alone couldn't hold off the full force of the Aranth Collective. They needed the rest of the fleet, and they needed it soon. Before he could respond, the ship's AI interrupted, its voice smooth and cutting. "Incoming transmission. Source: Counselor Lyra Selene of the Europa colony." Kale straightened, his pulse quickening. "Patch it through." The holographic map flickered, replaced by the image of Lyra. Her face was framed by the muted light of her command center, her expression composed, but her eyes tense. Lyra was one of humanity's most prominent leaders, a figure known for her pragmatism and sharp political instincts, but Kale had always sensed something colder beneath her polished exterior. "Kale," she began, her tone clipped. "The Aranth are regrouping. We've intercepted chatter suggesting they're planning a coordinated strike on our remaining colonies." Kale nodded. "We're aware. The Dranic have agreed to assist, but we're still working on bringing the rest of the black ships online. What's the status of Europa's defenses?" Lyra hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Adequate for now, but we won't hold if they come in full force. I hope you're not relying entirely on those relics. We need real leadership, not ancient machines." Kale's jaw tightened. "The black ships are part of the plan, Lyra. But I need Europa to hold the line. Every second we buy is another chance to rally our people." Lyra's gaze hardened, and for a moment Kale thought he saw something in her eyes. Doubt, or perhaps something darker. "Just be careful, Kale," she said finally. "You're playing with forces none of us understand." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Kale staring at the empty space where Lyra's image had been. A knot of unease settled in his stomach. Something about her words lingered, a warning unspoken. "Do you trust her?" Vance asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Cale shook his head. "I trust that she'll do what she thinks is best for Europa, but whether that aligns with what's best for the rest of us, I'm not sure." Vance exhaled sharply. "Well, I don't like it. She's too polished. People like that always have something to hide." Before Cale could respond, the ship's alarms flared, a sharp, piercing wail that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The holographic map reappeared, pulsing red as new markers lit up across the screen. "Multiple inbound signatures," the AI intoned. "Aranth vessels detected. Estimated arrival, 5 minutes." Cale's heart pounded. "How many?" 23 ships, the AI replied. "Composition suggests a strike fleet." Vance let out a low whistle. "That's not a test. That's a damn hammer." Cale turned to the command deck crew, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Prepare all systems. Defensive protocols active. Notify the Dranek. We're going to need them." The crew moved swiftly, their movements precise despite the tension in the air. Kyle watched them for a moment, a surge of pride and determination rising in him. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The minutes passed in a blur of preparation, the bridge a hive of activity. Kyle felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. He couldn't afford to falter, not with so many lives depending on him. As the first Aranth ships emerged from hyperspace, the Aegis Eternal surged forward, its sleek form cutting through the void like a blade. Its weapons flared to life, streaks of energy lancing out to meet the enemy. The Aranth ships responded in kind, their plasma cannons lighting up the darkness with fiery bursts. Kyle gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. The battle unfolded before him, a chaotic dance of light and shadow. He could feel the vibrations of each impact, the heat of the energy surges bleeding into the air. The taste of ozone lingered on his tongue, sharp and metallic. But even as the Aegis Eternal held its ground, Cale's unease grew. Something about the attack felt wrong. The Aranth were aggressive, but their movements lacked the precision he'd come to expect from their tactics. It was as if they were stalling, drawing the black ship's attention away from something else. "Commander," the AI's voice cut through his thoughts. "Unusual energy signature detected. Source, Europa colony." Cale's blood ran cold. "What kind of signature?" "Unknown. Signal strength suggests covert activity. Recommendation: investigate." Cale exchanged a glance with Vance, the unspoken question heavy in the air. Could Lyra be involved? "Vance, take over here," Cale said, his voice firm. "I'm going to Europa." "You're walking into a trap," Vance warned, but Cale was already moving. He boarded a small shuttle, the craft's engines thrumming as it launched into the fray. The battle raged around him, the flashes of light and fire casting long shadows across the shuttle's interior. Cale's mind raced, the unease in his chest growing with every passing moment. When he reached Europa, the colony's exterior was dark, its defense grid offline. The silence was deafening, the stillness a sharp contrast to the chaos above. Cale stepped onto the station, his boots echoing against the cold steel floor. The air smelled faintly of burnt circuitry, the acrid scent stinging his nostrils. As he made his way through the corridors, his senses sharpened, every sound and shadow setting his nerves on edge. Then he found her, Lyra Celine, standing in the command center, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a console. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice calm, but her posture tense. Cale's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing, Lyra?" She hesitated, and in that moment Cale saw the truth, the subtle shift in her expression, the way her hand hovered near the console. She wasn't defending Europa. She was sabotaging it. "Why?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Lyra's gaze hardened. "You don't understand, Kyle. Those ships, they're a threat to all of us. If the Aranth don't destroy us, the black ships will." Kyle stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You've doomed us all." Lyra pressed a button on the console, and alarms blared. Kyle's heart sank as he realized what she'd done. The station's power core was destabilizing, a deliberate act of destruction. "Get out, Kale," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "This is the only way." But Kale wasn't leaving. Not yet. As the station began to shake, he knew the real battle was only just beginning. The Aranth weren't the only enemy. Betrayal had come from within, and it threatened to destroy everything. The station groaned beneath Kale's feet as he sprinted down the corridor, the air alive with the acrid tang of overheating systems. Each step felt heavier than the last, the gravity plating faltering under the strain of the destabilizing power core. Red emergency lights painted the walls in jagged, flickering shadows, and alarms shrieked with unrelenting urgency. Kyle clenched his fists, Lyra's words still ringing in his ears. This is the only way. He couldn't allow her twisted logic to justify the destruction of Europa and the people she was supposed to protect. The betrayal stung deeper than the burns he'd suffered in combat. It was a wound to his trust in humanity's unity, a unity he was fighting to rebuild. A burst of heat scorched his face as a console near the bulkhead erupted, sparks raining down like molten stars. Kyle threw up his arm to shield himself, the acrid smell of burning insulation filling his nose. He coughed, his throat raw, and forced himself forward. His comlink crackled, Vance's voice cutting through the chaos. "Kyle, the core's destabilizing fast. Radiation levels are spiking. Get the hell out of there." Kale tapped the device, his breath ragged. "Not yet. I can't let her escape." "Forget her," Vance snapped. "You can't fight a collapsing station." Kale gritted his teeth. He couldn't explain it. This wasn't just about Lyra. It was about the weight of every decision he'd made since activating the Aegis Eternal. If he couldn't stop her now, how could he expect anyone to trust him to lead? Trust him to unite humanity? The next turn revealed the station's command center, its reinforced doors pried open by the tremors. Inside, Lyra stood at a console, her fingers dancing across the controls with frantic precision. The room was suffused with an eerie blue glow from the core's readouts, pulsating faster and faster like a frantic heartbeat. "Lyra!" Kale shouted, his voice cutting through the wailing alarms. She turned, her expression a mix of defiance and something that almost resembled guilt. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Kale advanced, the heat of the failing systems pressing against his back. "You're going to kill everyone here, including yourself. For what? To stop me? To stop the black ships?" "To stop them!" Lyra spat, pointing upward, as if the ships themselves were a malevolent force hanging over them. "You don't see it, Kyle. They're not humanity's salvation. They're its executioners." Kale shook his head, his voice softening. "You're wrong. They're tools, Lyra. They do what we make them do. This isn't the way." She hesitated, and for a moment Kale thought he saw a crack in her resolve. But then the tremors grew stronger, and her eyes hardened once more. "There's no other way," she said, her fingers darting to the console. Kyle lunged forward, slamming her hand away before she could trigger another command. She twisted, throwing an elbow that caught him in the ribs. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but he pushed through the pain, grabbing her wrist and wrenching her away from the controls. They struggled, the room shaking violently as another explosion rocked the station. The console behind them sparked, its screens flickering with warnings. Kale saw the words, "Critical core imbalance," flash in crimson before he pinned Lyra against the wall. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice raw. "I can fix this, but I need you to tell me what you've done." Her eyes darted to the failing console, then back to him. For a moment she faltered, and Kale pressed harder. "You said the black ships were dangerous. Fine, let me prove you wrong. Help me save these people." The weight of his words hung in the air, cutting through the noise. Lyra's breathing slowed, her gaze flickering with doubt. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. "I set the core to overload," she admitted. "But there's a bypass, an override code. You'll need to route it manually through the auxiliary control panels." "Where?" Kyle demanded. "Lower levels," she said. "You'll need to vent the reactor heat along the way, or the station will implode." Kyle released her, already moving. "Get to an escape pod," he he called over his shoulder. "If you try anything else, I'll know." Lyra didn't respond, and Kale didn't look back. His focus narrowed, the sounds and sensations around him fading as his goal crystallized. He sprinted down the corridor, his boots pounding against the groaning metal. The air grew hotter, every breath a struggle, as the station systems continued to fail. The auxiliary control panels were buried in the lower levels, a maze of cramped maintenance corridors thick with smoke and the cloying stench of melting plastic. Kyle dropped to his knees, crawling beneath a collapsed bulkhead, his shoulders scraping against the jagged edges of the metal. He emerged into a narrow chamber lit by flickering emergency lights, the control panel sparking in the center of the room. His hands moved instinctively, punching in commands as the heat pressed against his back like a living thing. The panel beeped angrily, its screen flashing with error messages. Kale cursed under his breath, his fingers flying across the controls. The comm link crackled again, Vance's voice cutting through. "Kale, what the hell are you doing?" "Stabilizing the core," Kale replied, his voice tight. "If I can vent the reactor heat, I can buy us enough time to get everyone out." "You're insane," Vance said, but there was a grudging note of admiration in his voice. "Fine. Tell me what you need." "Guide me through the bypass," Kale said, "and make it quick." The next moments were a blur of commands and warnings, Kale's focus razor-sharp as Vance guided him through the process. His hands moved on instinct, every action calculated and precise. The heat grew unbearable, the air thick with the metallic tang of sweat and fear. But Kale didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, the panel emitted a low hum, and the screen flashed green. The tremors subsided, the station's systems stabilizing. Kale slumped against the wall, his chest heaving as relief washed over him. "You did it," Vance said, his voice almost disbelieving. "You actually did it." Kyle allowed himself a small, bitter smile. "Not yet. I've still got to get out of here." The journey back to the surface was harrowing, every step a battle against exhaustion and the lingering effects of the station's collapse. When Kale finally reached the docking bay, he found Lyra waiting, her expression unreadable. The ship's AI acknowledged, and Kale watched as two more black ships stirred, their obsidian hulls shimmering to life. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying, a reminder of humanity's forgotten dominance and the precarious line they walked by reclaiming it. The battle erupted moments later, a symphony of light and destruction. The errant fleet advanced with ruthless precision, their sleek vessels weaving through the void like predators. The Aegis Eternal led the charge, its energy lances slicing through enemy ships with surgical ferocity. The newly awakened black ships joined the fray, their combined firepower creating a maelstrom of chaos. Kale stood on the command deck, the vibrations of the battle thrumming through the floor. Each decision came like a blade to the gut, the stakes higher than they'd ever been. "Redirect power to forward shields," he ordered, as an errant dreadnought unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. The Aegis Eternal absorbed the blow, its shields flaring brilliantly before retaliating with a devastating counterstrike. Amid the chaos, Kale's comlink buzzed. Nira Valine's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the static. "Kale, we've got movement on the Dranak front. They're holding the Aranth flanks, but they won't last without reinforcements." Kale's mind raced. The Dranak had been invaluable allies, but sending ships to support them would weaken Earth's defenses. His eyes darted to the tactical display, searching for a solution. Then it hit him. A gamble, but one worth taking. "Deploy the Solace Obsidian to the Dranak front," he ordered. "Tell them to hold the line. The Aegis Eternal and Vanguard Ascendant will cover Earth." Vance shot him a wary glance. "Splitting the fleet? Bold move." "It's not just bold," Kale said, his voice steady. "It's the only move." The battle intensified, the void ablaze with the fire of countless ships. Kale's orders came rapid fire, his focus unyielding as he coordinated the fleet. Each victory was hard won, each loss a bitter reminder of what was at stake. Then, the turning point came. The Aegis Eternal's AI delivered a chilling report. "Fail-safe countdown initiated. Source: unauthorized activation attempt detected." Kale's blood ran cold. "Explain." The AI's response was merciless. Saboteurs on board Vanguard Ascendant. They have triggered the failsafe. Containment protocols failing. Kyle's hands clenched, his mind spinning. The failsafe was humanity's greatest threat. A self-destruct mechanism designed to obliterate the black ships and anything in their vicinity. If it detonated, the battle and humanity would be lost. Override the failsafe, Kale barked. Impossible, the AI replied. Manual intervention required. Kale's heart pounded as he made his decision. Vance, take command. I'm going to the Vanguard Ascendant. Before Vance could protest, Kale was already moving, boarding a small fighter and launching toward the failing ship. The journey was a blur of adrenaline and resolve, the battle raging around him a storm he couldn't afford to notice. When he reached the Vanguard Ascendant, Kyle fought his way through its corridors, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The saboteurs were there, remnants of the factions that feared the black ships, but Kale dispatched them with cold precision, his determination unshakable. Finally, he reached the failsafe controls. The countdown read 0013. With shaking hands, Kale accessed the override system, his breath hitching as the seconds ticked away. Come on, he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. The air crackled with energy, the ship's systems teetering on the brink of collapse. At 002, the failsafe deactivated. Kale exhaled, the weight of the moment crashing over him. He slumped against the console, his chest heaving, but the fight wasn't over yet. Returning to the Aegis Eternal, Kale coordinated the final push. The errant fleet faltered under the combined might of the black ships and their allies. One by one, the enemy vessels fell, until the void was silent once more. As the dust settled, Kale addressed the surviving factions and allies. His voice was firm, his gaze unwavering. We won today not because of the black ships, but because we stood together. Unity is our greatest weapon, and we will wield it to rebuild, not to dominate, but to protect. The Aegis Eternal's voice echoed softly in the chamber. Mission parameters met. Humanity survives, awaiting further purpose. Kyle looked out at the stars, the vast expanse of possibility stretching before him. Rest now, he said quietly. When we call, you'll rise again. The black ships returned to dormancy, their purpose fulfilled for now. And as humanity began to rebuild, Kale knew one thing for certain. They would rise stronger. Together. Always.